Welcome to WHRO's Weekly Edition. I'm Doug Boynton. In this week's program, it's probably not a good idea to steal from the Navy. A former sailor found that out. We'll hear from one of the people who make elections in Virginia happen. And the on-again, off-again Norfolk casino project? Well, the odds got better. It's WHRO's Weekly Edition. The LGBT Life Center is partnering with a new provider in order to expand access to STI prevention medicine in Virginia. WHRO's Nick McNamara reported the story.
The center will work with Freddie, the leading mail-order provider of 2 STI and HIV prevention pills. One of the medicines, called pre-exposure prophylaxis, or PrEP, has been shown to reduce the risk of contracting HIV by up to 99%. The other, called DoxyPep, cuts the rate of chlamydia and syphilis cases by upwards of 75%. The partnership opens the door for Virginia residents to book an online appointment with Freddie medical staff at no cost to most users. A portion of the purchase of each prescription goes back to the LGBT Life Center. Nick McNamara, WHRO News.
Call it the case of the sailor with the stuff. A former Williamsburg sailor pleaded guilty in a federal court to stealing Navy gear from a local base and then selling it to his customers worldwide on the internet. WHRO military reporter Steve Walsh had the story.
52-year-old Richard Allen of California is a retired Navy petty officer first class. He admitted in federal court to being part of a conspiracy to steal more than $800,000 worth of supplies while he was stationed at Naval Weapons Station Yorktown in Williamsburg. Federal prosecutors in Rhode Island say Allen was part of a group that repeatedly broke into Navy warehouses and took body armor, working uniforms, winter gear, even Navy SEAL Trident insignia. They sold them to customers around the world. Some payment accounts were linked to China. The goods were stored in several states, including Rhode Island. Naval Weapons Station Yorktown Chatham Annex supplies the Navy's Atlantic Fleet. Allen is scheduled to be sentenced November 26. Steve Walsh, WHRO News.
Virginia Democrats are hoping the Harris-Walz policy proposals on housing will be a help in this year's elections. Virginia Public Radio's Michael Pope has the details.
If elected to the White House, Vice President Kamala Harris says she wants to offer $25,000 in down payment assistance for first-time homebuyers. That's something that could have a huge impact at the local level, says Alexandria City Councilman John Chapman.
How do you make sure that the supply that's coming in is not just affordable, but attainable to the folks that are in your community? And I think having down payment assistance is huge because there are very few people that are walking around with tens of thousands of dollars if they want to get a house that works for their family.
Harris is also talking about taking on corporate landlords by restricting rent increases to 5% for landlords with more than 50 units, as well as tax incentives for the construction of new homes. Delegate Charnel Herring says the Harris-Walz housing proposals could be a game changer for people across Virginia.
I was homeless as a teenager. I know what it means not to have shelter over your head, and certainly getting rental housing is great. But what's happening is that when we talk about generational wealth, families are not able to have that American dream.
While Democrats are talking about increasing the supply of housing, Donald Trump and the Republicans are talking about decreasing demand by deporting undocumented immigrants, as well as allowing some housing development on federal lands and reducing mortgage rates. I'm Michael Pope.
In January of 2018, balance of power in the state legislature was determined by drawing a name out of a bowl. That historic moment would not have happened without a Newport News poll worker named Ken Mallory. He's the first Virginian featured in a new series from the Virginia Center for Investigative Journalism at WHRO, chronicling the stories of, regular people who make our democracy work through their career, their activism, or their volunteer work. VCIJ at WHRO's Lou Hansen brings us Democracy at Work.
Well, I'll call to order this meeting of the Virginia State Board of Elections this morning on January 4th, 2018. We're here today to conduct a drawing to determine the winner of the House of Delegates 94th District. And this election will certainly be a reminder for everybody that every vote counts, as we encourage all eligible.
I was firmly ensconced in my house. It was winter break and I was a teacher, so I was happy to be at home. My name is Ken Mallory. I'm 40 years old. I work for Virginia Tech. I'm the director of what we call our Citizen Leader Track program in the Virginia Tech Corps of Cadets. I chose to become an election official in the fall of 2008. The registrar in Newport News at the time put out a call in the daily press that Newport News was anticipating record high turnout. And it was great. You're there at 5 a.m., you don't leave until 8 or 9 at night, but I had a blast.
A surprise historic ruling in a tight race in Hampton Roads, and the 94th District could decide who controls the House in Virginia.
For years, the House of Delegates had kind of swung one way or the other, Republican or Democrat, just depending on a few key races. And it seemed like that year was one of the key races was going to be the 94th District, which encompasses Newport News. The 94th, which at the time was being represented by Republican David Yancey, was being closely challenged by Shelley Simons. We had no idea how close it was ultimately going to end up being. The losing candidate, who in this case was Shelley Simons, I think it was 13 votes if my memory serves me correctly, which was well within the percentage that allowed her to request a recount. The registrar calls me and said, hey, would you like to be one of the recount officials? I had no idea how the process works, so I said, count me in. You don't actually look at every single ballot that was cast. The machine counts it. Well, there are some ballots that the machine doesn't know what to do with. Those types of ballots were the ballots that we as recount officials were to look at and engage with. There was one important one. I was like, hey, mark next to the Republican name here, I think this is a Republican ballot. My counterpart said, no, you can't say that because he didn't actually fill in the ballot. We don't know what this voter's intent was. Ultimately, I was persuaded by his argument, and so it went into the unreadable pile. Got to the end of the day, the electoral board goes behind a curtain for a little bit, comes back out and said, all right, we've got an announcement. The electoral board reported that it had been a 14-vote swing and that Shelley Simons had won by 1 vote. My thought immediately flashed back to that one ballot that we'd argued about. It should have gone in the third pile. It was not for us to decide. I was able to make it home for dinner. It's the week that the family gets together. Everyone wants to know how it went. And I'm like, but there was this one ballot. And the more I talked about it, the more bothered I kind of got. And so I was like, while my memory's fresh, I should really write this down in case someone has any questions. I was in the process of typing when my phone rings. Hello, I'm the legal representation for the Yancey campaign, and I'd like to ask you some questions about today. Once I got the okay to actually talk to the attorney, it was actually kind of relief. The attorney started asking questions, and they very quickly drilled down to that one ballot. And he was like, hey, would you mind writing up a statement? Sure, no problem. And he was like, great. When can I get it from you? I pulled in at about 7 o'clock to work that morning, and he meets me at my school. The election recount was due to be certified that day in circuit court. The judges decided that, yes, they were going to open the letter. The electoral board, when questioned by the court, said, yes, we're confident we can find that one ballot. The judges decided to look at it and decided to count that ballot's vote, which in that case was a vote for David Yancey.
There sat the stoneware bowl in the middle of the table with the Board of Elections, and Yancey's name was placed in a tube, and Democrat Shelley Simons' name was placed in another tube. Well, both tubes were then placed in the bowl. The winning tube was drawn, and inside was David Yancey's name.
I gave the institution enough information for our process to be able to work. We accept in this society that sometimes the choice of the people is not necessarily your choice, but the choice of the people is a fair choice. And when I was a poll worker, that's something that I always strove for.
For VCIJ at WHRO, I'm Lou Hansen.
This is WHRO's Weekly Edition. Remember, for any stories you've missed, you can visit us on the WHRO smartphone app or all social media platforms.
Still ahead on Weekly Edition, we hear about a new book shedding light on an old plague. We'll get the latest information on staffing problems at the Virginia Aquarium, and the Pamunkey Indian tribe has a new partner they're hoping will improve their casino chances. But first, Second Gentleman Doug Emhoff emphasized Vice President Kamala Harris's commitment to workers in Newport News this week as his wife seeks the presidency. WHRO's Ryan Murphy was there.
Emhoff cited several of the current administration's policies, like requiring labor agreements for federal construction jobs and growing trade apprenticeships, as evidence Harris has prioritized American workers.
Biden-Harris administration delivered all that, and that's going to continue in a Harris-Walsh administration. Because she knows what's good for families, it's good for the economy.
Emhoff told a crowd of Democratic faithful at Representative Bobby Scott's annual Labor Day cookout that this election shows a stark binary between Harris and former President Donald Trump.
This is an election on who better understands what you go through, what your family goes through.
The second gentleman's appearance marks the third visit to Hampton Roads by a presidential candidate or their spouse so far this year. The latest polls show Harris narrowly leading Trump in Virginia by about 3 points. Ryan Murphy, WHRO News.
Governor Glenn Youngkin was in Suffolk on Wednesday for the groundbreaking of a big warehouse and logistics center that has taken some flack from local residents. WHRO's Nick McNamara reported the story.
Governor Youngkin calls the planned Port 460 Logistics Center in Suffolk a foundational element of the future of development in Hampton Roads.
When we build the winning ecosystem for transportation and logistics and infrastructure, it becomes the winning ecosystem for business, which then translates into unbridled opportunity and prosperity.
Port 460 will increase commercial access to the expanded Port of Virginia and contain around 5 million square feet of warehouse space. Officials expect the center to draw millions of dollars in investment to the region. Opponents have raised concerns about increased traffic congestion as well as pollution related to Port 460 and sued to stop the development. The lawsuit was dismissed in 2023. Nick McNamara, WHRO News.
The Navy will meet its recruiting goal for the first time in 2 years. WHRO's Steve Walsh reported that.
A tight job market made recruiting challenging for all of the services over the last few years. The Navy was the last service to announce that it expected to be on target by the end of September. Navy Vice Admiral Rick Cheeseman told the Associated Press that the upturn in recruiting came so late in the year that the Navy doesn't expect to be able to get the last 5,000 sailors through boot camp by the end of the fiscal year. Like the other services, the Navy has offered retention bonuses and other incentives to help close the gap. The Navy also followed the Army's lead and created a remediation program for recruits with lower test scores. The service also lowered its testing standards. The recruiting pinch has left the Navy undermanned throughout the fleet. Steve Walsh, WHRO News.
A new nonfiction book explores how yellow fever devastated Hampton Roads in the mid-1800s. It's called The Fever, the Most Fatal Plague in American History. WHRO's Catherine Hafner spoke with author Lon Wagner, a former Virginian Pilot reporter who now lives in Roanoke.
Your writing on this topic began at the Virginian Pilot 2 decades ago. What originally sparked your interest?
Well, as a resident of Norfolk, I lived in Colonial Place, and I heard that there was going to be a Civic League meeting where somebody from the health department was coming to talk about the influx of rats we had in our neighborhood. And I went there, and there was this woman, and she hated rats and mosquitoes. And so I went up to her afterwards, and I said, "Why are you so determined to keep mosquitoes and rats in check?" And she said, "Well, I'm sure you've heard of the 1855 yellow fever epidemic." And like a lot of people around here, I had heard of it, but I only knew a tiny bit about it. And so I started looking into it, and I just couldn't believe the epidemic happened right here where we all live.
So paint the picture of when yellow fever hit Norfolk and Portsmouth in 1855.
Well, a ship named the Benjamin Franklin had come in from the West Indies, and all that spring, yellow fever hopped from ship to ship in harbor in St. Thomas. And so this ship headed north, was bound for New York. It was bad luck that it ended up here. And along the way, it began leaking. So they turned into Hampton Roads, the body of water, to get the ship repaired in Portsmouth. So mosquitoes were breeding on the ship on the way north, and they had also infected crew members of the ship. There were mosquitoes on shore here, obviously, as there always are. When those mosquitoes on the ship came and started biting local residents, then that injects the virus into a resident. So then when other mosquitoes bite that person, other mosquitoes get infected. So it becomes this very rapidly multiplying transmission loop. It was, in my estimation, the most fatal epidemic in U.S. history because 1 out of 3 people who remained here in town that summer died from yellow fever.
How do you think this crisis shaped our region in a lasting way?
Well, think about this. So bankers, the head of a railroad, city leaders, police officers, police chiefs, newspaper editors died. This was the next leadership class of these 2 cities. And it just makes you wonder, like, were things sort of throttled at that time? And in combination with the Civil War, maybe these 2 cities could have been great booming meccas of the East Coast. And they were sort of tampered back by this epidemic. And of course, there's no way to know for real.
Did what you know about the yellow fever epidemic influence your experience during the COVID-19 pandemic a few years ago?
I saw a lot of common characteristics, and a lot of those characteristics were not really about the science or medicine, but in terms of how people behave when they are really, really frightened. And I think that's what drove the 1855 epidemic, and I think that's what drove a lot of the action during the COVID pandemic. It's interesting because I don't think there are many medical lessons to be learned from the 1855 epidemic because the medicine was so bad at the time. The lessons are more about how people treat each other and how to get through something like that. Everybody should best band together and help each other.
Why do you think this history has been so overlooked until now?
I think what happened is after the epidemic, very soon after that, the Civil War broke out. And Norfolk was an occupied city, and the next 5 years just sort of swept previous history away. I had a couple of motivations for writing this book, and one was that I have 3 daughters, and they had heard me talking about this darn thing for so long that I didn't want to leave it unfinished. And the second was because Norfolk and Portsmouth and Hampton Roads, it seems like they're often part of somebody else's story, and I really want people around here to know this is our story. And this is something that our cities survived, and it's a really big part of U.S. history.
Wagner's book is available now on Amazon and at Prince Books in Norfolk. The odds got better for a Norfolk casino this week. The Pamunkey Indian tribe will bring in one of the largest casino operators in the country to help get its long-delayed Norfolk project moving. Details from WHRO's Ryan Murphy.
Boyd Gaming will become the majority owner of the Pamunkey Tribe's development partner, according to documents that will be presented to Norfolk City Council in the coming weeks. Mayor Kenny Alexander says Boyd's newfound involvement has given him confidence in the long-delayed project.
Of course, they were struggling to get the project out of the ground, and bringing in Boyd, someone with the ability and the wherewithal and the experience, and more importantly, the financial strength to build a world-class casino resort hotel is exactly what we need.
Boyd runs 26 casinos in 10 states. The company builds and operates the businesses. The Pamunkey Tribe now has about 14 months to get a casino operating and licensed, or they'll lose the voter approval from 2020 and have to hold another referendum. Ryan Murphy, WHRO News.
The Hampton Roads LGBTQ community came out over the weekend in a show of force for Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. WHRO's Barry Graham reports.
About 200 people showed for a political rally for the Harris-Walz ticket at Norfolk's MJ's Tavern, a well-known gay-friendly establishment in the Riverview neighborhood. Billed as an Out for Harris rally, local, state, and federal politicians showed to offer their support. Norfolk Mayor Kenny Alexander, Delegate Marcia Price, and 3rd District Congressman Bobby Scott all gave remarks endorsing the ticket. Price is the first out black woman in the Virginia General Assembly. She noted that it was 20 years ago that Harris officiated at the first gay marriage ceremony held in California. The owner of MJ's, John Childers, and an organizer for the event, said getting out the vote was critical, especially in this year's election.
We can't sit at home and just hope, well, we got enough people who's going to vote. You have to go vote. You have to get involved.
Abigail Southern Klein also helped organize the event and said reproductive justice compelled her to get involved in this year's election.
Seeing how many women, couples, people across this country that has affected when Roe v. Wade was overturned. And, especially within the LGBTQ community, it is vital that we have not just a president and vice president, but a Senate that is going to do something to make sure that this can't happen again.
The overturning of Roe v. Wade by the Supreme Court was a major issue with attendees, as many felt that the court could potentially revisit the 2015 Obergefell decision, which legalized same-sex marriage. Norfolk resident Vivian Page said she was fearful.
I have to protect myself for the long term and my wife for the long term and not have to worry about our marriage being taken away from us and all the benefits being taken away from us. So this is important.
Against a backdrop of rainbow flags and banners proclaiming equality for all, attendees waved Harris Walsh signs. Close by, a voter registrar was signing up new voters and a campaign organizer was enlisting volunteers. And there appeared to be, in the parking lot of MJ's on a hot Saturday afternoon, a feeling of optimism and determined cause. Barry Graham, WHRO News.
In the end, Virginia Beach decided to keep its partnership with the Virginia Aquarium, but an audit of the facility found that staff are confused about their future through the whole process. WHRO's Michelle Hankerson reports.
According to the new report, the aquarium is having trouble replacing and keeping employees. Virginia Beach City Auditor Lyndon Ramios says staff said they don't want to commit to a place where the future is unknown.
There's a human aspect to it. These are our employees, and they feel that.
Beach leaders started discussing a new ownership model for the Virginia Aquarium last summer, as renovation and maintenance costs reached $250 million. The aquarium has been operating at a loss for the last 3 years. Last year, it ended $2.8 million in the red. Michelle Hankerson, WHRO News.
2 Marines from Camp Lejeune are back on board their Norfolk-based ship after being roughed up in Turkey over the weekend. WHRO's Steve Walsh had that story.
Marines from the Norfolk-based USS Wasp were on leave in Izmir, Turkey when they were assaulted on the streets at 3 p.m. local time Sunday. A video circulating on social media shows one of the Marines being held and a bag placed over his head. A second Marine pushes his way into a group which is shouting, "Yankee, go home." The Marines were taken to a local hospital but were not harmed. NCIS is cooperating with local officials. No Marines have been detained, says Commander Timothy Gorman, U.S. 6th Fleet spokesperson. The USS Wasp Amphibious Ready Group left Norfolk in May. They have been in the eastern Mediterranean, part of a buildup of U.S. forces in the regions as tensions remain high as fighting continues between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. Steve Walsh, WHRO News.
You've been listening to WHRO's Weekly Edition. We had help today from Nick McNamara, Catherine Hafner, Steve Walsh, Ryan Murphy, Lou Hansen, Barry Graham, and Michelle Hankerson. We also had help from VPR's Michael Pope. And Jordan Christie produced today's broadcast. A reminder, you can always catch full episodes on the Weekly Edition podcast feed. You can get your news updates at WHRO.org, on the WHRO smartphone app, and the WHRO Reports podcast feed. For all of us at WHRO and WHRV, I'm Doug Boynton. Stay safe. Be well.